The smell of pot roast and sweet potato casserole used to be my favorite thing about Thanksgiving. My aunt made it from scratch every year, the kind of recipe passed down so many times nobody remembered where it started. I used to sit in her kitchen as a little girl and watch her hands move without measuring anything, just feeling the amounts by instinct. I wanted to be like that someday. Confident, sure of myself. That was a long time ago. By the time I was 26, sitting at that same table, I had become the cautionary tale they told when the younger cousins talked about their college plans. My uncle would lower his voice just enough to make sure I could still hear it. You don't want to end up like Lena. Bright girl. Threw it all away. Then someone would laugh softly and change the subject, and I would look down at my plate and cut my sweet potato into smaller and smaller pieces until I didn't have to look at anyone. I had left law school after my first year. That part was true. What they didn't know, what nobody at that table knew, was why. And I intended to keep it that way for as long as I needed to. My cousin Fletcher was the golden one. Fletcher with his JD from Georgetown, his firm downtown, his beautiful wife, who wore the right shoes to every family event. My aunt and uncle had framed his bar exam results. Actual framed certificate hung in the hallway next to the family photos. I walked past it every time I visited and said nothing. Fletcher and I had grown up more like siblings and cousins. We used to build forts in the backyard and argue about comic books and stay up too late watching old movies we were too young to understand. I loved him the way you love someone you've known your whole life, with that specific mix of irritation and loyalty that only family can create, which made everything so much harder. The first time I noticed something off was not at a family dinner. It was at a gas station on a Tuesday in March, almost 2 years before that Thanksgiving. I was in my second semester at a regional field office, working a case that had nothing to do with my family, when a name came across my desk in a financial disclosure document. Fletcher Allen Morrow. I stared at it for a long time. Then I closed the file and went to get coffee. Then I came back and opened it again. I told my supervisor that evening. She looked at me for a moment without saying anything, then asked me if I was sure I could handle what might come next. I told her I didn't know. She said that was the most honest answer she'd heard all year, and she reassigned 3 agents to the case the following morning. Then she looked at me and said, "You stay on it, you know these people. That's an advantage we don't throw away." I went home that night and sat on my apartment floor with the lights off for a long time. What Fletcher had built was elegant, which I say without any admiration. He had structured it the way someone structures something they intend to last. Carefully, in layers, with enough distance between each piece that no single point of failure would collapse the whole thing. He was running money through a series of small real estate holding companies, none of them impressive enough individually to attract attention. Each one had legitimate tenants, legitimate leases, legitimate paperwork, but threaded through the documentation, if you knew exactly what you were looking for, was a pattern. Cash moving in through rental deposits, moving out through renovation invoices paid to contractors who did not exist. The contractors were the key. 9 different LLCs, registered in 4 different states, all tracing back through enough layers of shell ownership that it had taken a forensic accountant 6 weeks to untangle. The money flowing through those invoices belonged to people Fletcher was representing as clients. People who needed their funds to look clean before they entered the legitimate economy. He was a very good lawyer. He was an even better launderer. The thing about working a case against someone you love is that the evidence doesn't care how you feel about it. I would read due bank records at 11 o'clock at night and find myself thinking about the summer we were 15, and he taught me how to drive in the church parking lot, and then I would turn the page and find another fabricated invoice and the memory would go cold. I got very good at compartmentalizing. I had, too, my aunt was not involved. That took us 4 months to confirm, and I won't pretend I wasn't relieved. She is a woman who makes pot roast from scratch and frames her son's achievements in the hallway and believes, genuinely, that a firm handshake and a good name are all a person needs. She would not have survived knowing what was happening in her own house. My uncle was a different question for longer than I wanted it to be. He had introduced Fletcher to 2 of the clients whose money eventually moved through the shell companies. Whether he understood what he was introducing is something I cannot tell you with certainty. Even now, the investigation concluded that he did not. I believe that conclusion. I also know that belief and certainty are different things, and I will carry that difference for the rest of my life. The Thanksgiving I sat through 2 years into the investigation was the second hardest day of the whole thing. Fletcher sat across from me and talked about a case he was working, Something about a commercial lease dispute, and he was funny and warm and attentive the way he had always been. He refilled my water glass without being asked. He remembered that I didn't like cranberry sauce and moved it to the other end of the table. I watched him the entire meal and found nothing. No guilt in his eyes, no hesitation, no tell. Either he was genuinely unaware that the federal government had been examining his financial records for 18 months, or he was very practiced at this. Both possibilities were devastating in different ways. My uncle made his comment about me during dessert. Fletcher laughed along with everyone else. It was a short laugh, reflexive, the kind you produce in a room without really thinking. He probably didn't even register doing it. I registered it. Not because it hurt more than usual. It hurt exactly as much as usual, which is to say considerably, but because I looked at him laughing at me and I thought, for the first time with any real clarity, I am going to have to testify against this person. I put my fork down and asked my aunt if she needed help in the kitchen. The arrest happened on a Wednesday in October. I was not present for it. I had recused myself from the operational side months earlier, which my supervisor had strongly encouraged and which I had agreed to without much argument. There are things I could not have watched without it affecting me in ways that would compromise everything that came after. I found out through an official notification, the same way I would have found out about any case. My phone showed a message at 7:42 in the morning. I read it twice. Then I got up and made coffee and stood at my kitchen window and watched a squirrel argue with a bird over something in the gutter. My aunt called me at 9:15. She didn't say much. She was crying in that controlled way. People cry when they're still trying to hold on to something. I told her I loved her. I told her I would come as soon as I could. I didn't tell her anything else, and she didn't ask me anything I would have had to answer. My mother called at 10:30. She had been told by then enough of the truth to understand what had happened and what my role in it was. The silence on the phone after I finished explaining lasted long enough that I checked to see if the call had dropped. Then she said, "How long have you been carrying this?" 2 years, I said. Another silence. Then, "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I couldn't." She exhaled slowly. "I know," she said. "I know you couldn't." That was the moment I cried. Not when I read the notification. Not during any of the previous 2 years of late nights and evidence reviews and family dinners. Right then, on the phone with my mother, when she said she knew, the trial was scheduled for the following spring. Federal cases move at their own pace, which is to say slowly and then very suddenly all at once. I spent months preparing my testimony, going over it with the prosecution team, making sure every detail was precise and defensible and unambiguous. Fletcher's defense was competent. I expected nothing less. They challenged the forensic accounting methodology, questioned the reliability of several witness statements, and attempted to establish that the shell company structure had been designed by a third party without Fletcher's knowledge. It was a reasonable strategy given the evidence against him. It was also unsuccessful. I remember the morning I was scheduled to testify. I wore the same thing I wear to every court appearance. Dark suit, minimal jewelry. Nothing that draws attention away from what I'm saying. I had eaten breakfast, which was more than I managed the day before. I had slept 4 hours, which was more than I expected. I sat in the hallway outside the courtroom and listened to the ambient noise of the building. Footsteps, distant voices, a door closing somewhere down the corridor. I had been in courtrooms many times before, for other cases, other testimonies. This should not have felt different. It felt completely different. The prosecutor came out to find me about 10 minutes before I was called. She was the kind of person who had the same expression for every situation. Calm, prepared, slightly ahead of whatever was happening. She asked if I had any questions. I said no. She nodded and went back inside. I looked at the ceiling for a while, then the door opened and someone called my name and I stood up and walked in. The courtroom had that particular quality of formal rooms where sound moves differently, where everything seems slightly more deliberate than it would anywhere else. I walked to the stand and was sworn in and sat down, and I was aware without looking directly that Fletcher was at the defense table to my left. I did not look at him yet. The prosecutor stood up. She waited one beat, the way she always did, and then she said clearly, "Please state your name and title for the record." "Lena Calloway," I said. "Special Agent, IRS Criminal Investigation." The sound that came from the defense table was not loud. It was a breath, a very specific kind of breath. The kind a person makes when something they were not prepared for has just landed. I had been listening for it in some part of myself I hadn't admitted to since I walked into the room. I looked at Fletcher then. His expression had rearranged itself quickly. He was composed, controlled, the years of courtroom training doing their work. But for just a moment before that, in the half-second between hearing my title and reassembling his face, he had looked at me with something I can only describe as genuine bewilderment. Not anger. Not betrayal. Just the look of someone whose understanding of reality has just been quietly revised. I held his gaze for exactly as long as I needed to, and then I turned back to the prosecutor. "Special Agent Calloway," she said. "Can you describe your role in this investigation?" "Yes," I said. "I can." I testified for most of that day and into the following morning. The defense cross-examination was thorough and professional and ultimately couldn't find purchase anywhere that mattered. The methodology was sound. The documentation was airtight. I had made sure of both over 2 years, precisely because I knew this moment was coming and I could not afford to give anyone a reason to question it. The jury deliberated for 3 days. I spent those 3 days doing ordinary things with extraordinary focus. Grocery shopping, laundry, a long walk along the river on the second afternoon. My mother called twice. My aunt did not call, and I understood that and did not take it personally, or tried not to. On the third day, my phone rang while I was making dinner. I turned the stove off and stood in my kitchen and listened. Guilty on all 12 counts. I put the phone down on the counter. I stood there for a moment. Then I turned the stove back on and finished cooking, because the alternative was to stand in my kitchen indefinitely, and I had already spent enough of my life standing still waiting for things to resolve. My aunt and I met for coffee in January, a few weeks after sentencing. It was her suggestion. I hadn't known if she would want to, and I hadn't pushed it. She chose a place neither of us had been to, which I thought was deliberate. No associations, no memories attached to the corner table. She looked tired in the way people look when they've been working very hard to hold something together. She ordered tea. She didn't touch it for the first 10 minutes. She asked me how long I had known. I told her. She was quiet for a while. Then she said, "All those dinners." "Yes," I said. "You sat there and listened to your uncle talk about you like?" She stopped. "You never said anything." "I couldn't." "I know." She turned her cup in small circles on the table. "I know you couldn't." We sat there for a long time. She drank her tea eventually. I told her about the investigative process in general terms, the parts I was allowed to describe, enough for her to understand the shape of what had happened without the details that weren't mine to share. She listened carefully, the way she used to listen when I was small and explaining something I was excited about. When I was done, she reached across the table and put her hand over mine and didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "I owe you an apology." I shook my head. "Lena." Her voice was firm in the way her voice gets when she means something. "All those years of dinners, the things your uncle said. The things I didn't say back. I owe you that apology and I'm giving it to you whether you want to take it or not." I took it. My uncle called me in February. I hadn't expected that. We spoke for about 40 minutes, and it was halting and uncomfortable and necessary, the way those conversations are. He didn't make excuses for the things he'd said about me over the years. I don't know if he would have, unprompted, but I gave him the opportunity and he didn't take it in the wrong direction. He said he had been wrong. He said he had believed things about the shape of a life, what success looked like, what a woman my age should be doing with herself. That he was rethinking. I told him I appreciated that. I didn't tell him it was enough because I didn't know yet if it was. Some debts take longer to settle than others. People sometimes ask me, usually people who don't know the whole story, whether I regret it. Whether I would do it differently if I could. I understand why they ask. It looks from the outside like a clean story. Woman proves herself, family is humbled, justice is served. The kind of story with a satisfying shape. The inside is less clean. The inside is 2 years of family dinners where I smiled and passed the bread rolls and said nothing while evidence I'd reviewed sat in a locked file on a government server. The inside is my aunt's face when she found out, and the sound of the phone when she didn't call during those 3 days of deliberation. The inside is Fletcher's expression in that half second before he composed himself, and the fact that I still think about it. I don't regret the work. I became an IRS criminal investigator because I believe in what it means. That financial crime is not a victimless category, that the people hurt by money laundering are real and specific and rarely the ones whose names are in the newspapers. I believed that before this case, and I believe it more firmly now. What I carry is more complicated than regret. It's the weight of a choice that was right and was also costly, and the understanding that those two things can both be true at the same time without resolving each other. I make pot roast now on holidays. I don't have the recipe my aunt uses. I've never asked for it, not yet. I work from a version I found and modified over several years until it tasted close to right. It's not the same, but it's mine, and I made it, and that's something. I've thought a lot about what it actually costs to do the right thing. Not in the abstract, the way people talk about integrity at graduation ceremonies or in motivational quotes they share online. I mean the real cost. The specific, personal, unglamorous cost of choosing correctly when the wrong choice would have been so much easier to live with, at least in the short term. Fletcher did not become who he became overnight. That's the part I keep coming back to. He was careful, methodical, intelligent, and he used every one of those qualities to build something that hurt people who never knew his name. The intelligence was always there. The work ethic was always there. What wasn't there, somewhere along the way, was the question of whether what he was doing was worth doing. He never seemed to ask it. And because he never asked it, 2 years of his life and the trust of everyone who loved him dissolved into federal case files and courtroom transcripts. That's what happens when ability operates without conscience. It doesn't stay neutral. It doesn't just sit there being impressive and directionless. It finds a use for itself, and if there's no internal compass keeping it honest, the use it finds is almost always, eventually, a destructive one. I don't say that to be harsh about my cousin. I say it because I watched it happen in real time, in someone I knew well. And the lesson is not something I can afford to file away and forget. For my own part, I spent 2 years being the person nobody at the dinner table thought I was. I sat through comments about my choices, my trajectory, my apparent failure to amount to anything, and I said nothing. Not because I was weak, because the work required it, and the work mattered more than being understood in that moment. That distinction took me a long time to really hold on to. There's a version of staying quiet that comes from fear, from not believing in yourself enough to push back. And there's a version that comes from knowing exactly who you are and what you're doing and choosing to protect that over short-term vindication. The second version is harder. It requires a specific kind of patience that doesn't come naturally to most people, including me. I had to build it deliberately, the way you build any skill. Through repetition, through choosing it over and over again in small moments before the large moment arrived. What I want people to take from Lena's story is not the courtroom scene. That moment is satisfying. I understand why it lands the way it does, but it's just a moment. What actually built that moment was 2 years of unglamorous, unrewarded, privately painful discipline. Every dinner she sat through, every comment she absorbed, every late night reviewing documents when the easier choice would have been to walk away. The outcomes we recognize and celebrate are almost always the visible tip of something long and quiet and invisible underneath. Nobody applauds the 2 years. They applaud the 30 seconds in the courtroom. But those 30 seconds were only possible because of everything that came before them, and that's the part we're thinking about. If you're in the middle of something hard right now, something where you're doing the right work and nobody around you can see it yet, I don't have a simple answer for you. What I have is this: the choice is compound. The discipline you practice in the small moments is the same discipline that holds you together in the large ones. It doesn't feel like that when you're in it. It feels like nothing. But it's not nothing. It's everything, actually. You just can't see it yet.